My name is Rachel Mays. I've been a member of this church since about 2009, and then I've been on staff since about 2014, 2015. And I'm really excited to kick off our summer series this morning. So pain and loss is inevitable. It can take many forms. It looks like a broken relationship, pain from the church, maybe a strained marriage or miscarriage, abuse, moving or a job loss, disease, and ultimately death. And sometimes pain is predictable and you can see it coming. And sometimes pain comes up from behind you like a sweeping flood and leaves you completely disoriented. Or like 85-mile-an-hour winds like last night. And you feel like you're drowning. And sadly, we cannot protect ourselves from pain. There's no way to avoid it. In fact, Jesus promised it when he said in John 16:33, "In this world you will have trouble." But he also said, "Take heart, because I have overcome the world." Author Jerry Sitzer writes that the experience of loss itself does not have to be the defining moment of our lives. Instead, the defining moment can be our response to the loss. I heard someone say pain and suffering will either harden your heart or it will soften your heart. It will either destroy you or it will deepen you. So will I be destroyed by pain or will I be deepened by it? What powerful choices is God inviting us to make in the midst of pain? What does it look like as followers of Jesus to respond to pain and loss? How do we lament and grieve? What hope can we cling to? So our summer series is called Loss, Lament, and New Life. And throughout the summer, different members of our church will be sharing stories of loss, what it has looked like for them to respond to that loss, and the choices they have made in their grief, and the hope that Jesus has revealed to them in that journey. So would you pray with me? God, we just invite your presence with us, and we just profess that, we just want to meet with you this morning. We want to hear from you. We want to worship you. So we just ask for your Spirit to be present. I ask, Lord, that you would just speak through me. Lord, would you just open up our hearts to hear from you this morning, Lord? And I just pray all this in your name, Jesus. So many of you know my and Roland's journey of infertility. I talk about it a lot. In fact, I honestly feel insecure talking about it again this morning. You know, the grief of infertility is a bit strange because it's different from like a moment, like a death or a tragedy. It's a grief that encompasses the passing of time. Ron and I have often talked about how it can feel like we're stuck in dried mud, watching everybody move forward. It's ongoing, but it can also change in a single moment. And my initial response to this grief was to try to control. And then when I realized you can't control this, I tried to medicate the pain through TV, food, spending money. And then after 2 years, I got to a point back in 2016 where I just asked the Lord, I was like, do we need to surrender this? Do we need to let go of biological children and move on? And I felt like what he said in return was, do not stop asking. And it's a whisper I've just heard over and over again throughout the years. It's been a journey of persevering in hope and prayer, and at the same time learning to live with an unending sorrow, to keep asking over and over again, and yet feel the disappointment of not receiving an answer. I remember back when Roland and I were first married, we'd talk about how many children we wanted to have. I remember Roland saying, since he was one of 2 children, he'd love it if we had a big family, had at least 4 kids. We talked about different names for our children. And Roland would also talk about how he didn't want to wait till we were too old before we had kids because he wanted to be young enough that he could play sports with his children for many, many years. And we now experience feelings like, Well, just one child would be amazing. And we don't really talk much about what we name our children in case it never happens. There's the loss we experience at every family gathering, wishing we had children that could play and have relationships with our nieces and nephews. Our friends our age are in a different phase of life, a phase of having young and growing children. And a lot of times we just feel like we don't fit in at times. And about 2 years ago, we both felt like Jesus opened the door for us to pursue fertility treatment. So throughout all of 2022, we went through 4 procedures called an IUI, and they all failed. Then we visited a fertility specialist in Houston who recommended in vitro fertilization, which is commonly called IVF. And it's the most invasive type of fertility treatment. And previously, we were never really open to the idea, but after the appointment, we were really surprised because we just felt like God was changing our hearts, and we felt like he opened a door for us to pursue it. So we started pursuing IVF early this year, and we just kept asking God to open doors, and he led us to a clinic in Tennessee. We packed up our car. We drove to Tennessee for almost 2 weeks at the end of March. I remember pulling away, wondering if we would return with 1 or 2 additional members of our family. So we went into IVF knowing like there were no guarantees. We were choosing to open ourselves up to the possibility of disappointment. However, we felt this hope that these past 8 years of this road were leading to this moment. We were hopeful that we would come out of this IVF cycle pregnant. And the beginning of the cycle was really exciting. Everything went according to how our doctor thought it would. And halfway through, there were 6 little embryo lives. And we felt a sense of awe and wonder at the glory of Jesus, the one who authored those lives. And 4 days later, we showed up at the clinic for the transfer procedure where they would put 1 to 2 embryos back, hoping that they would implant. And the doctor came in, and he started updating us on the 6 embryos, and initially just kind of went all over my head. Like they were the information was coming in faster than my mind and heart could process. But what it came down to was that most likely 4 of the embryos had stopped growing, and our doctor recommended we transfer the remaining 2 embryos. The transfer procedure should have been exciting and joyful, but it wasn't. It honestly felt traumatic. We didn't realize how much we'd be affected by the possibility of losing 4 embryos. I just think we expected that we'd have additional embryos that we could come back for. And I remember when we left the clinic, we just sat in our car in the parking lot, and we just felt completely blindsided. Over the course of 5 days, we experienced the joy and beauty of life, and then also experienced the death of some of those same little bitty lives. The next morning, they called to confirm that the other 4 embryos had died, and there was nothing they could do. There was nothing we could do. They were gone. And I remember feeling the grief hit me, and it felt like a sweeping flood. I felt like I was drowning. It felt like some of the very words written in the Psalms, like Psalm 69. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths where there is no foothold. I have come into the deep waters. The floods engulf me. I'm worn out, calling for help. My throat is parched. My eyes fail, looking for my God. Or also, like Psalm 77, I cried out to God for help, for him to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord at night. I stretched out untiring hands, but I would not be comforted. Will he reject me forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed? Has he forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? When I think of the stories I've made in my grief and disappointment these past 9 years, and particularly the choices I made during this past IVF cycle, I think of the story of Lazarus. And the story is found in John 11. Jesus receives news that Lazarus is sick. And Martha and Mary, his sisters, they send word to Jesus, hoping he'd come and heal Lazarus. However, Jesus waited 2 days to come. And by the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had died. Now remember, Mary and Martha, they're watching their beloved brother die in front of them. Lazarus is probably or possibly the breadwinner, the one who provides financial security and takes care of them. We don't get any sense from any of the Gospels that their parents were around. So Lazarus may have been their only remaining family member. And his death would have put them in a very vulnerable position in the society of that time. And this is also happening in the very context of them having met Jesus of Nazareth, who they believe has been sent by God to save Israel. At this point, Jesus has multiplied food to feed more than 5,000 people. He's healed people. He's turned water into wine. He's calmed the sea. And Jesus is no stranger to them. He's one of their friends. So they ask because they had hope that Jesus could heal Lazarus. But he didn't come. And Lazarus died. What do you think Mary and Martha felt when Lazarus died? Maybe it felt like a crushing disappointment or like an overwhelming flood. They would have felt completely disoriented. Like this Jesus who performed miracles and healed people didn't come to heal our brother. Why? They would have been familiar with the Psalms. They probably grew up hearing the Psalms recited. So when Lazarus died, it's possible that words from the Psalms came to mind. Like Psalm 69. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths. I've come into the deep waters. I'm worn out, calling for help. Or Psalm 77. I cried out to God for help. I cried out for him to hear me. Will he reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? After experiencing profound disappointment in Jesus, how do Mary and Martha respond? Do they turn away from him? Do they rethink who they thought Jesus was? Like, maybe he isn't the Son of God. Because if he was, surely he would have come and healed Lazarus. Do they back off from Jesus? Or do they lean in? On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. She answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who's come into the world. So when Martha hears that Jesus has come, she seeks him out. She goes to find him. She leans in. She doubles down. Martha professes the truth of her belief in who Jesus is. She starts out with, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. She's saying, I know this is who you are, even though I didn't see it. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. When her circumstances seem to contradict who Jesus is, She drives a stake in the ground and chooses to profess the truth. She doesn't reduce her theology of God because of her disappointment. She leans in and she pursues Jesus. Her response is similar to what she may have heard from the Psalms growing up, like towards the end of Psalm 77, where it says, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds, because your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? Because you are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the people. She leans in and she defiantly professes the truth. And what about Mary? It says, after Martha had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, see how he loved him. So Mary, she leans in as well, but in a different way. She professes raw and expressive honesty. She falls at Jesus' feet and says, you didn't come. Where were you? She may have been feeling the Psalm 77. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has he forgotten to be merciful? Has he withheld his compassion? Both of these are powerful ways to respond to disappointment, professing our belief in the truth of who Jesus is, and at the same time, being very honest with him. They are not mutually exclusive. They do not contradict each other. And both of these have been transformative for me. I've been asking God for biological children for over 7 years. I've put myself out there and taken risks of faith in asking. I've taken risks in being vulnerable with people about this area of my life. I've been bold in sharing this publicly, whether like today, speaking about this, or sharing on the prayer mic, asking for people to pray for us. And over 7 years of prayer have gone unanswered. Failed IUIs and a failed IVF cycle. And one of our IUIs was almost a year ago, because my anniversary is actually tomorrow. One of our IUIs was scheduled on our anniversary, and then 2 weeks later, we found out it failed on Father's Day. Like, it almost feels a little cruel. Like, how could you, Lord? I've experienced disappointment in God over and over and over again. The past 7 to 9 years, my journals are filled with raw honesty, asking God what he's doing. Where are you? Why won't you answer? Expressing to God how much of a fool I feel like. Asking him to vindicate me for walking by faith and putting myself out there. After our second IUI failed, this is what I had written in my journal. Why, Lord? I'm crushed and heartbroken. I have held on. I've put myself out there for you. And at the same time, professing the truth about who he is. And a few lines later, I wrote this, but you're so good. I trust you. I bless you, Lord. I know that you love me and that you see me. And I believe that you are the God of the impossible, that you are a God who performs miracles, that you are the God who fills barren wombs, even though I haven't seen it. and you're the one who deeply satisfies me. I don't know why, but after every disappointment, there's something in me that is doubled down, something within me that won't let go of this until I see resolution. I don't know, maybe it's just the confidence and the goodness of God, and I'm just kind of waiting to see him work it out in this. I believe the choices I've made in response to disappointment in God has been a hinge in my relationship with him and has swung me into a deeper and better life. There is always hope when we experience disappointment in God, but will we lean in and will we be honest when that comes? How does Jesus respond when Mary and Martha lean in? He's not put off by their honesty. He's not offended. When Martha professes her belief in who he is, he reveals a new aspect of himself to her. He tells her, I am the resurrection and the life. Leaning into Jesus in the face of disappointment is an invitation to a deeper knowing of Jesus and a fuller faith. And in response to Mary's question and tears, Jesus is deeply moved. Her raw honesty moves his heart. He's troubled. He weeps. He empathizes. He doesn't try to solve Mary's problem. He just steps into her pain, and he felt it with her. Psalm 56:8 says, you keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. Jesus truly collects our tears like how he collected Mary's tears. He keeps track of every sorrow and every loss we experience. Not one moment of pain goes unrecorded and unseen by the Lord. I think the most powerful moments I've had with God are when I've chosen to lean in after disappointment in this journey. Instead of medicating the pain, I've chosen to endure the pain, to sit in the pain with God and trust that he'll meet me in that place. And I believe that he's always responded. And he's given me something better than an answer to prayer. He's given me himself. And what I mean by that is I feel more alive than ever. I feel a sense of joy and hope and overflowing life that is no longer dictated as much by my circumstances. And I think it's come from experiencing the presence of Jesus in that place. And knowing Jesus has become the reward in this whole thing. And I really think I've come to know him more through the disappointment. I've experienced the goodness and joy of daily spending time with God, of being able to say and truly mean it, Jesus, you are my portion in this life. You are my great reward. There is always hope because God always meets us in our disappointment when we lean in. What happens next? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor if he's been in there for 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Mary and Martha, they asked for a healing, and instead they experienced a resurrection. They experienced the glory of Jesus on a different level. They experienced something better than what they asked for. God was moving in ways that Mary and Martha could not see. They thought that when Lazarus died, it was game over, that it was final. They felt like the psalmist in Psalm 69, that they were sinking into the pit and the waters were drowning them without any hope. But when Lazarus was raised from the dead, maybe they remembered the end of Psalm 77. The waters saw you, O God. And when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, and you led your people like a flock. With God, nothing is impossible. He is always moving in ways that we cannot conceive of. And there is always hope because he's always moving. After over 7 years of asking, 4 failed IUIs, 1 failed IVF cycle, I do not know what God is doing. I do not understand. And if I'm completely honest, I feel very foolish. I cannot express how difficult it is to over and over again take risks in asking and inviting people to pray with us, and then to once again face the disappointment and feel like a fool. But I'm so convinced that God is moving in power in some mysterious way. I don't understand, but I will trust him. And I believe he's called me to not stop asking. So I'll stay with it. I trust that his way for me is through the sea and that I'm not going to drown. There is always hope because God is always moving in ways that we cannot conceive of. There is always hope. That is true. Even in disappointment in God, when we choose to lean in and be honest, there's always hope because God always meets us in our disappointment. There's always hope because God is always moving in ways that we cannot conceive of. He's doing something better. The day after the transfer procedure, I said that we found out that the other 4 embryos had died. And I would have to wait another 8 days before having a blood test to determine if pregnancy occurred. Until then, I cried on and off every single day. I grieved the loss of those 4 little embryo lives. I also grieved the possibility that I could lose the 2 little embryos that I carried inside of me. The grief felt overwhelming, like a flood threatening to drown me. But only by the grace of God working in me, I just kept choosing to lean in and double down and believe that there's always hope, whatever happens. And out of that place, I kept asking, I kept leaning, and I believe Jesus met me in that place with his presence. I could sense he was very close. It was the strangest feeling grief and fear, yet at the same time feeling the power and beauty of the presence of Jesus. Based on the blood test, what my doctor discovered was that 1 or both of the embryos initially implanted, but then died. It was a very, very early miscarriage. So we went from 6 embryos to 2 embryos, and then ultimately we lost all of them. And still to this day, those 6 little embryo lives are such a gift. Like, I'm so thankful to Jesus for them. One of our nurses calls them, they're God's littlest image bearers. And the next morning, I remember sitting with Jesus, grieving the finality of it, leaning into Jesus in that disappointment. And I felt his love cover me like a blanket. I knew that he was with me, that he was suffering with me in my grief. As I've experienced his presence these last 9 years, knowing Jesus has become the true reward, not children. Children isn't the hope. The hope is Jesus. And Jesus never disappoints. He's the real treasure. There's nothing that can satisfy the way that the presence of Jesus does. Pain, loss, and disappointment don't feel as much of a threat anymore because there's always hope. And moments of disappointment, they're just opportunities to lean in and take hold of and gain Jesus. We're actually going to do a second round of IVF in July. And once again, we're asking, and we're ready to lean in if disappointment comes. And we have a hope that God will meet us if pain comes. And we're trusting and believe that God is moving in ways that we cannot conceive of. Even though there's no guarantee with this second IVF cycle, there's one thing I know for sure, that Jesus will be there. And because of him, there's always hope. So the worship team can come up. Will we believe that there's always hope no matter what? When we experience disappointment in God, there is an invitation from him. It is an invitation to lean in and not back off. It's an invitation to believe that there's always hope. I believe one of the reasons Jesus wept with Mary was because he was watching his people experience something that was not his intention: death. Pain, loss, and death was never God's intention for our world. And that day when Jesus resurrected Lazarus, they had no idea what was going to happen about 2 weeks later. But Jesus knew. Jesus probably saw himself in Lazarus. He saw that just like Lazarus, Jesus was going to go to the grave. This story of Lazarus is pointing to something bigger. It's just a small picture of the redemptive story at work in the entire history of creation. Around 700 years before Jesus, the prophet Isaiah wrote the following about him: that he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Surely he has borne our grief and carried our sorrow, yet we considered him punished by God. Jesus didn't even have to suffer, but he chose to suffer. He chose to submit to death. He chose to lay in the grave, and then he rose from the dead, and he broke the power of death. He broke the power of any pain, any loss we experience. Jesus defeated death with death, which is crazy. Paul writes, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Because Jesus rose from the dead, there is always hope, even in the darkest circumstances. There is always hope, because one day Jesus is going to restore everything, like everything. And this hope is not just wishful thinking. Like, we use that word, we say, I hope I get to hang out with my friends today, or I hope it doesn't rain, right? No. This hope has been forged by the blood of Jesus. It is like certain, it is like the strongest thing. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain where our forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf. This hope is a confident expectation of good. This hope is not wishful thinking, it's certainty. Because Jesus rose from the dead, someday everything is going to be okay. The resurrection of Jesus didn't replace death, it transformed death and suffering. Moments of pain and loss are never final. They're never wasted by God. They are moments bursting forth with hope and redemption. Always. And there's a day coming when everything will be completely and fully restored. And on that day, we will experience the fullness of God's resurrection power and restoration, when every single pain and loss that we experience in this life will be completely reversed, and it'll actually be made better than before. So because of that, I can stare at my infertility in the face and know that even if Ron and I never have biological children, there's always hope. And there's an irreversible hope that God will redeem and restore this one day in ways that are unimaginable for me. And that is the hope that we have because of Jesus Christ. there's always hope. Will y'all stand with me? We'll pray. Yeah, God, I just ask for a supernatural outpouring of your hope. Would you just fill us with the hope of Jesus? Just a confidence of just like your goodness that you are working in our lives, in the situations that feel like they are beyond redemption. God, would you just, open up our eyes to see. Give us eyes of faith. Jesus, I just pray for an outpouring of hope on all of us in Jesus' name. And I just pray that even this summer, that as people are sharing their stories, that the hope in us would just build, that it would just become just this, just contagious. I just pray, Jesus, that you would just lead us in this worship, that we would